I would like to thank, first of all, Boaz and Iris, Miriam, for inviting me to the conference. It is my pleasure, and also to thank Naama for the introduction. The title of my talk today is Dwelling on Horrors, Hannah Arendt's Attitude Towards Holocaust Survivors' Testimonies. And it is actually a section in one of the chapters in my forthcoming book. Although Hannah Arendt's analysis of life in the concentration camps and her reflection on total domination, a term that I will speak about shortly in a few seconds, although they are based in great part on testimonies of survivors, her attitude towards first-hand accounts is skeptical and ambivalent. The doubts that Arendt expresses in her first work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, from 1951, regarding the value of eyewitness accounts in explaining the life in the concentration camps, are not exceptional in light of the general attitude of historians, who traditionally rarely drew on survivors' testimonies and often treated them with mistrust. The late Raoul Hilberg and Lucy Davidovich, for example, two of the most prominent Holocaust scholars, were always suspicious towards testimony. They preferred to distance themselves from testimony and ignore it altogether, as they believe that the nature of testimony and memory is in conflict with the main goal of the historical profession, the search for factual truth. My central contention in this article is that Arendt's attitude towards survivors' testimonies and her tendency to downplay the experience of survivors should be understood not only on the ground of the general perception in society at the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, which could not deal with survivors' accounts, but primarily in light of some of Arendt's broader theoretical concerns about political judgment and political mores that focus on suffering, compassion, and pity, as reflected in Origins and in her later works. I will begin my presentation by briefly introducing Arendt's notion of total domination and the sources she used in order to construct her theory. The aim of the totalitarian regime, Arendt argued, was total domination, namely to eliminate spontaneity as a properly human expression and hence to destroy man as a moral agent and as an individual. The totalitarian experiment in total domination, according to Arendt, can be realized almost to perfection, in her words, only in the concentration camps, the central institution of the regime which served as its laboratories. In Origins, Arendt described the 3 steps towards the establishment of total domination. The first step involves destroying the juridical person. The second step, according to Arendt, is the murder of the moral person in man. That is, the destruction of moral agency. The third step in the process involves the destruction of the differentiation of the individual or his unique identity. After the Second World War, accounts of both the Nazi and Soviet concentration and slave labor camps began to appear in survivors' memoirs, novels, and diaries, as well as in official documents. Arendt read many of these accounts, and for the writing of Origins, she especially relied on the works of David Rousset from France, Egon Kogan from Germany, and the account of Bruno Bettelheim. The 3 of them were survivors of Buchenwald and Dachau, early concentration camps in Germany. Only Bettelheim was Jewish. As she read such works, Arendt reached the conclusion that the concentration camps were the fundamental apparatus that distinguished the totalitarian regime from other types of governments. I will turn now to talk about her attitude towards survivors' testimony. The concentration and extermination camps hunted Arendt since she first realized that the rumors about them were true. Their existence laid behind her preoccupation with the problem of evil from Origins through Eichmann in Jerusalem and until the rest of her life. In Origins, Arendt argued that only people who, I quote, have not actually been smitten in their own flesh in the concentration camps and are consequently free from the bestial, desperate terror can afford to keep thinking about horrors, end quote. The survivors of the concentration camps, according to Arendt, are not capable of reflecting on their own experience in any meaningful way. An eyewitness account by a survivor is problematic for Arendt because it is given by a person who, in her understanding, was reduced to, quote, a bundle of reactions that separates him as radically as mental disease from everything within him that is personality or character, end quote. Any effort of survivors to describe their experiences remains unintelligible, unimaginable, and incredible, as Arendt writes, and I quote, the experiences themselves can communicate no more than nihilistic banalities, end quote. Testimonies of survivors are banal because while they convey a series of remembered occurrences, they lack any thought, according to Arendt. And they are nihilistic in the sense that they tell a story about an absence of reality, suffering, and loss. The experience of the survivors cannot provide us with the proper solution to the problem that they raise. They can only serve as a yardstick for judging what sort of conditions we should fight against, how people ought not to live. The experiences of the survivors in and of themselves cannot teach us about the camps, according to Arendt, because they lack positive content and therefore they are not unique. Eyewitness accounts are inherently incommunicable as they try to communicate things that evade human understanding and human experience. Anyone speaking and writing about concentration camps is still regarded as suspect. This is what Arendt wrote back then in 1951. Even the survivor himself, she wrote, has, quote, has doubts with regards to his own truthfulness, as though he had mistaken a nightmare for reality, end quote. What Arendt reveals here is an accurate perception of the contemporary atmosphere regarding survivors of the camps. Although numerous testimonies of camp survivors were already available in the 40s, in the late 40s, they fell on deaf ears. Not only do testimonies lack thought, there is also no common language that can bridge, quote, the terrible abyss that separates the world of the living from that of the living dead, end quote. Psychologically speaking, the inability and unwillingness of the survivors to share their experiences, which in their own eyes looked incredible, with others, went hand in hand with the reluctance of the audience to listen to these tales of horror. As we know today, it took 3 decades until the survivors stopped being suspect and became instead privileged witnesses in our society. But Arendt went further than most of her contemporaries by refusing to give meaning to suffering. Although she is not indifferent to it, Arendt emphatically argues that the suffering inflicted on the victims in the camps, intense as it was, is not the distinguishing characteristic of totalitarianism. Quote, suffering, of which there has been always too much on earth, is not the issue, nor is the number of victims. Human nature as such is at stake. The immense suffering of the victims portrayed in testimonies not only distract us from the main issue at hand, which is, according to Arendt, this attempt of totalitarianism to change human nature, it might also affect us in a negative way by provoking the emotion of pity. Arendt's wish to avoid being carried away by suffering can be traced from origins through Eichmann in Jerusalem on to her later writings. Following Nietzsche, Arendt vigorously criticized the politics of pity, epitomized in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's work. In her analysis of Rousseau and the French Revolution, in her work On Revolution, Arendt ties Rousseau's emphasis on compassion and pity in his political theory and the pity and terror of Robespierre. According to Arendt, both compassion, which is the capacity for suffering with others, and pity, a sentiment which is the perversion of compassion, are located in the human heart and hence should not play a role in the public sphere. Arendt's alternative to compassion is solidarity, which is a principle that partakes of reason and hence of generality, and therefore is able to comprehend all mankind. Solidarity is not guided by suffering, and in contrast to pity, keeps its sentimental distance between people. Whereas pity can be enjoyed for its own sake, and thus remains passive, solidarity can lead to action, which is, for Arendt, political by its nature. Reading Origins in light of Arendt's crystallized ideas in On Revolution regarding suffering and compassion can help us better grasp her attitude towards the survivors. When writing a political theory on totalitarianism, Arendt, the impartial observer who is free from the bestial, desperate terror, does not allow the suffering of the camp's victims to arouse any passions in her that will lead her astray from reason. This distance, according to Arendt, is the fundamental condition for historical understanding and judging. In Arendt's contention that the victims who survived the camps cannot truly reflect on what had happened to them, we find the seed of her understanding of judgment. Only in the more general context of Arendt's theory of judgment, which prioritizes the spectator disinterested reflective point of view over that of the engaged actor, can we understand her stance regarding who can or cannot afford to keep thinking on horrors. In her writings, Arendt presents two distinct models of judgments, one based on the standpoint of the actor and the second, which I refer to here, on the standpoint of the spectator. In her work, The Crisis in Culture, Arendt argues that the human capacity to judge, which is a specifically political ability, is one, if not the most important activity. Arendt's understanding of political and moral judgment as the faculty of the spectator is drawn upon Kant's theory of aesthetic judgment. According to Kant, reflective judgment is related to what he calls enlarged mentality, namely the ability to think from the perspective of everyone else, or to reflect upon one's judgment from a universal point of view. That is, only the disinterested observer is in the position to see the whole that gives meaning to the particulars. Following Kant, Arendt argues that only the spectator, those who are not engaged in the game themselves, can truly reflect on and judge the spectacle. The capacity of the disinterested spectator to think representatively, that is, from the perspective of everyone else, is exercised through the faculty of imagination, which is closely related to historical understanding. It should be stressed, however, that the ability to think from the perspective of someone else's is not empathy. As opposed to empathy, enlarged mentality does not necessarily mean assuming or accepting the point of view of another person. It merely means taking into consideration the possible viewpoint of the others, thinking in the place of others, or putting oneself in somebody else's shoes. The notion of empathy contradicts Arendt's understanding of critical thinking and their basic idea of plurality. Arendt's writing undeniably did not reveal great empathy for those who actually experienced the terror of the camps on their own flesh. Was she trying, however, to represent or imagine their standpoint? Some commentators have argued that Arendt was more successful in representing the perpetrator than the perpetrated, better able to recapture the mind of the anti-Semite than the Jew, that of the white Boer settlers than the blacks in South Africa. To conclude, although Arendt uses testimonies of camp survivors, a fact that might seem paradoxical in light of her low appraisal of their value, as in Eichmann in Jerusalem, so in Origins, her attitude towards the survivors is instrumental. Testimonies such as those of Rousset, Bettelheim, and Kogan are utilized by Arendt as historical evidence from which she constructs her theory of total domination. It is a means, a raw material, but not the central factor. Arendt is not interested in their human experiences as such for reasons that I have outlined in this presentation: her criticism of pity, her withholding of compassion, and her belief that a spectator may exercise political judgment in a way a participant cannot. All of the above seem part of an effort to distance herself from anything that, for her, hampers her liberty to form political concepts. As opposed to Arendt, I am convinced that as scholars who dwell on horrors, our responsibility as thinkers is to listen very attentively and very thoroughly to survivors' testimonies. The literature of Holocaust survivors' testimonies is a very fertile ground for thought, especially in regards to Arendt and her emphasis on the human condition and plurality. I believe that survivors' account the insights of people who experienced the camps in their own flesh are invaluable sources for historical understanding. Indeed, precisely because these accounts aspire to describe a reality in which common sense is absent, we need to listen to them. Surely Arendt was right when she called the camps a phantom world, indicating that the survivor himself often does not believe in its own story. Certainly some oral testimonies may be unreliable, and sometimes memory plays tricks on survivors. All of these limitations, however, do not make testimonies less valuable. Finally, I find Arendt's clear-cut distinction between the categories of the actor and the spectator dubious, even more so given her contention that genuine philosophical reflection is the exclusive skill of the latter, a priori denied to the former. This is a strange argument which seems to owe more to the idealistic tradition of German philosophy than to a careful consideration of the intrinsic value of testimonies. Even if one is willing to go along with Arendt's claim that testimonies are imperfect, since necessarily removed from the event they aim to reflect, there is little reason to assume that the spectator is somehow better equipped to overcome this difficulty, as if the actual experience of the horror is a permanent obstacle to understanding. The fact that some of the most prominent Holocaust historians, such as Israel Gutman, Shaul Friedlander, and Dov Kulka, are survivors themselves, only reinforces my argument. Thank you.